All right, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a discussion on religion and the rise of capitalism, featuring Dr. Benjamin Friedman, William Joseph Mayer Professor of Political Economy at Harvard University, and author of the recently released book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. A quick note on the flow for the evening. We'll have a talk from Dr. Friedman, followed by Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question, feel free to do so using the Zoom Q&A function found at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, I would now like to turn it over to Nan J. Morrison, President and CEO of the Council for Economic Education, for her opening remarks. Nan?
Thanks, Thomas. Good evening, everyone. We are enormously privileged to host this event tonight with Professor Benjamin Friedman, a formidable public intellectual, economist, writer, friend, and CEE board member. Ben Friedman's work in life exemplifies so much of what CEE strives to accomplish, demonstrating to and teaching our kids that the world is comprehensible, that there's information as well as concrete skill sets for negotiating it and building lives that are better for each subsequent generation. In short, adding to what is good, even in this extraordinary time. We've all had another lesson or drill in adapting to sudden catastrophic change, daunting for any of us. For fragile communities, for families living paycheck to paycheck, for kids who are already struggling for a foothold, any foothold in a better life, this crisis has seemed virtually insurmountable. It is our job to make sure that it isn't. This crisis brought home to me, our board, and our staff just how tenuous financial stability can be for many Americans and the toll that acute anxiety takes on our children. It revealed fault lines throughout our society that cannot be merely vaccinated away. It falls to each of us now, within our particular purviews, to make a contribution to what is better, what is hopeful, what builds us all up. And so I am, as always, so happy to join the like-minded in exploring ideas. There is always hope in thought and greater understanding. And I don't think there is anyone on the planet with a more robust intellect for whom ideas are never in short supply as Professor Friedman. I will admit, rather sheepishly, that I could barely decipher the excerpt that I read nor the New York Times review of his latest book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Nonetheless, I was brave and started it. It is a great read, a new look at economics. The Times calls it a major work, a masterpiece. Well, here's what they actually said. This overview cannot even begin to pay homage to the prodigious research informing Friedman's analysis. He covers not only the main thinkers in both economics and theology, but also the less well-known ones who helped shape their thought. He can credibly discuss the philosophy of John Locke and the science of Isaac Newton. As one reads Friedman, words like magisterial, masterpiece, and magnificent flow through one's thoughts. While writing major works, including his previous opus, The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, Professor Friedman also serves as the William Joseph Mayer Professor of Political Economy at Harvard, where he was also the chair of the Department of Economics. Among his many distinctions, Ben has received the George S. Eccles Prize, awarded annually for excellence in writing about economics, and the John Commons Award, given every 2 years for recognition of contributions to economics. He's a good personal friend, someone whom I would describe as both wise and kind, two virtues that we should all prize highly, even if they can't be monetized. Ben, over to you.
Thanks for that very generous introduction, Nan. It's an honor to appear on this CEE program, and let me say that I'm proud to be a longstanding CEE board member. I believe in the mission of CEE, and I think Nan and her staff have done a remarkable job over the years of delivering on that mission. I support CEE personally, and I hope everyone else will as well. Now, it's a great honor, as I say, to me to be able to talk this evening about my new book. I have some slides that I would like to put up. So let's see if we can make that happen. I hope everybody is now seeing some slides, and Nan, unless you tell me that's not true, I'm going to proceed. So the book is called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. And the central question I undertake in this work is where modern Western economics came from. Why did our way of thinking about economics and the economy emerge when and where it did? And to be specific, what I'm going to take as the centerpiece of modern Western economics is what we call the first welfare theorem, or the first fundamental welfare theorem, namely the proposition that individuals acting on no more than their own self-interest, with no altruism involved, can, and under the right conditions, will wind up making other people better off. As well. Now, this, if you pause to think about it, this is a rather, although we take it for granted today, this is a quite remarkable insight. And the question I want to explore is where this came from. The usual presumptions are twofold. First, people point to Adam Smith and his great work of 1776, The Wealth of Nations. Donald Winch, alas, no longer with us, but the greatest Smith scholar of our lifetimes, pointed to Smith's Wealth of Nations as what he called the fountainhead of classical political economy. And I think that's the standard view. And the second part of the standard view is to recognize that because Smith and our discipline more generally were products of the Enlightenment, in particular the Scottish version of the Enlightenment, they therefore were part of the movement away from a God-centered universe toward belief in what in today's vocabulary we would call secular humanism. Nick Phillipson, in his prize-winning biography of Adam Smith, said that not just The Wealth of Nations, but Smith's entire intellectual project were built on the foundations of the Enlightenment's, as he put it, quintessential assault on religion. And I don't think Phillipson said or thought he was saying anything particularly new. That was just part of the standard set of presumptions. Now, I'm going to accept the first of these two presumptions. I believe it's absolutely true that Adam Smith stands as the father of our discipline, and The Wealth of Nations is the great book that pioneered the way for future developments. But I'm going to reject the second of these presumptions. It's true, of course, that Smith was part of the Scottish Enlightenment, but I don't think it follows from there that his work was part of any kind of assault on religion. Instead, I believe that the entire Smithian revolution that gave us modern economics was enabled by the religious thinking of that day, in particular, the movement away from belief in predestinarian Calvinism. In a few minutes, I'll be clear about what I mean in that regard. And the mechanism here is that this movement away from belief in predestinarian Calvinism opened the way for a more expansive and more optimistic view of the possibilities for human choice, human action, human agency. And this more expansive view of human agency became the heart of modern economics. Now, to clear up one potential misunderstanding right at the outset, I am not suggesting that any of this had to do with the self-conscious action of religiously committed individuals bringing their religious beliefs to bear on their professional work. These men, like Adam Smith and his intellectual mentor and closest friend, David Hume, became international celebrities within their own lifetimes. And so we know a great deal about them biographically, and it would be absurd to suggest that they were religiously committed individuals trying to do something like that. Hume, for example, was a notorious opponent of any kind of organized religion. He was an outspoken skeptic, agnostic. Many people think he was an atheist. He used to refer to Church of England bishops as retainers to superstition. His close friend, William Robertson, the head of the Church of Scotland, referred to him as a virtuous heathen. Adam Smith was more private about his personal religious beliefs, but I think at most we can identify him as some kind of deist, along the lines that here in America we would identify with his contemporaries Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson. So if that wasn't what was going on, well, what was it? I would point to Einstein for the central concept on which I draw in this book. Einstein had the view that any kind of thinker deals not with the world as a whole, but with a world view. In Einstein's original German, the Bild der Welt, and that it's this kind of a simplified view of the world that people deal with simply because the world as it exists is too complex. And Einstein was clear that, as he put it, scientific thought is a development of pre-scientific thought, and pre-scientific thought for any individual thinker importantly turns on and focuses on this Weltbild or world image. Now, is it fair to apply this kind of thinking to economists? Einstein didn't mention economists. He mentioned painters, he mentioned poets, he mentioned philosophers. Philosophers is important because Adam Smith was not an economist. The word didn't exist in his day. He was a professor of moral philosophy, but certainly people have thought this kind of idea applies to economists. One of my distinguished predecessors in my department at Harvard, Joseph Schumpeter, thought in the same way that when any economist sits down to do economics, he or she proceeds on the basis of what Schumpeter called a pre-analytic vision. Incidentally, that capital V is Schumpeter's, not mine. And my dear friend and much missed colleague, Ken Galbraith, pointed out that economic ideas are always and intimately, as Ken put it, a product of their time and place. Well, I'm going to argue that Smith and Hume and their contemporaries who gave us modern economics clearly had an image of the world, an Einsteinian Weltbild, a Schumpeterian vision in mind, and that it was very importantly shaped by the thinking of their time and their place, in particular, the religious thinking of the day. Now, let's be clear about what Smith's contribution was. If we go back to 1700, we can summarize economic thinking as it was in these three propositions. First, could individuals correctly understand their own economic interest? And the answer was probably they couldn't. And for that reason, as of 1700, the idea was that it was necessary to run economic activity from the top down. The French had their mercantilist system. The English had all of these government-granted monopolies. Some kind of dirigiste system was necessary. Second, and more centrally, however, even if individuals could figure out what it was in their interest to do in the economic sphere, there was no presumption whatsoever that their acting on their self-interest could make anybody but themselves better off. And for that reason, acting on your own self-interest was deemed to be morally opprobrious. The standard noun applied to such behavior was vice. The standard adjective was vicious. If we skip forward to 1790, I picked 1790 simply because that's the year in which Smith died. By that time, his great book, which was immediately recognized for what it was, had already gone through 5 editions in English, lots of foreign translations. By that time, the answers were rather different. Could individuals correctly perceive their self-interest in the economic sphere? Smith thought yes, when they acted as producers of goods and services. Smith was a very careful thinker. And in the same way we think about a mathematician who doesn't want to assume anything that's stronger than what he minimally needs to prove his theorem, Smith only assumed that people get it right when they act as producers. He had scathing things to say about the foolish and frivolous and misguided choices that people make when they act as consumers, especially by the rich. Second, in terms of the first welfare theorem, Smith absolutely got right that when people act on their own self-interest under the right conditions, they will make other people better off as well. And for this reason, by the time we get to The Wealth of Nations, the whole vocabulary of vice and vicious is simply gone. Smith uses those words many times, but never, ever to refer to merely acting on your own self-interest. Now, to acknowledge, Smith did have intellectual predecessors, some in France, which is important because Smith lived in France for 2.5 years before he started to write the great book, and some in England as well. And so right at the start, we have to confront the question of whether these predecessors deserve the credit instead. Maybe people like me should think of Bernard Mandeville or Pierre Nicole as the father of our discipline instead of Smith. My answer is a resounding no. It was Smith who gets the credit, not these earlier people. And the reason is that they had no understanding of the role of markets or competition in bringing about this result. And one might say, well, okay, they didn't have our answer, our explanation, but they didn't have any other explanation either. They simply didn't understand it. And especially for a generation of intellectuals who had been trained in Newtonian concepts of system and mechanism, this just wasn't going to fly. Newton's great work, the Principia Mathematica, had been published in 1687. By the time Smith was an undergraduate in the 1730s, the book was part of the standard curriculum at every Scottish university, also at Cambridge, interestingly not at Oxford, and maybe that's why Oxford lagged behind scientifically for so many decades. But for this generation of Newtonian thinkers, the ideas of these previous people, precursors of Smith, just didn't make it. So what was the argument of The Wealth of Nations? First, Smith assumed that our desire for material gain is just a part of human nature, and it's no more morally opprobrious than the fact that we eat and we breathe. Smith has a lovely passage in which he says that the desire to better our condition comes with us from the womb and stays with us until the grave, and in between there's scarcely an instant in which it isn't operating. And of course, bettering our condition could mean lots of things, but he immediately goes on to make clear that he is referring to our economic condition. Second, he makes clear that at the center of his mechanism are competitively set wages and prices, and he describes the way in which these competitively set wages and prices get the economy to the right place and make people better off in strikingly Newtonian language. If you read the passages, he could be describing planets circling around the sun. Of course, he's not. He's describing the economy. Third, he sees these competitively set wages and prices as the products of two-way bargains in which the buyers on one side and the sellers on the other side, including the sellers of labor, are merely trying to do the best they can for themselves. There's no altruism involved. Everybody is just trying to get a higher price if he's a seller and a lower price if he's a buyer. And as a result, Smith has lots of statements about how this competitive market mechanism is an example of the Enlightenment principle of unforeseen and unintended consequences. And for that reason, we think of this proposition as an example of what he called the invisible hand. It is that the market mechanism working in its proper way is globally beneficial. People acting on their own self-interest make other people better off as well. This is the invisible hand proposition. Some people on this call may have seen this statue. This is the Adam Smith statue that stands in the middle of the Market Square in Edinburgh, right across from where Smith's office was when he was a commissioner on the Board of Trade. If you look carefully at the hands, the statue incidentally is full of lots of symbolism, but if you look in particular at the hands, you can see the left hand very clearly. That's okay. But if you look, you can't make out the right hand, and that's not an artifact of the position from which I took the photograph. That's part of the intended symbolism. The sculptor, Sandy Stoddard, I had the privilege of having dinner with him one night when I was on a research trip to Edinburgh. Stoddard did that deliberately to symbolize the invisible hand. And as I think we all know, because of Smith's belief in the invisible hand proposition, he was firmly opposed to any kind of impediments to the competitive market mechanism. But for purposes of this audience, I think it's important to emphasize that Smith was never the free market ideologue that he has been painted by many political and economic conservatives throughout the 19th and 20th century and today. Smith did not see the market mechanism as some kind of hothouse fragile flower that needed to be defended at all costs against any incursions. Yes, he was against government monopolies. Yes, he was against mercantilism. Yes, he was against the tendency of businessmen to collude and enter into what he called combinations. We could also think of Smith as the father of antitrust theory, but because Smith was impressed by how robust this mechanism was, not how fragile, and for that reason, he was very prepared to accept all sorts of interferences when there was a legitimate public purpose. So just to list a few, Smith was in favor of progressive income taxes, something that I bet most of the people who walk around wearing Adam Smith neckties are completely unaware of. Typical person who wears an Adam Smith necktie is somebody who's heard of The Wealth of Nations but never read it, and probably hasn't even heard of the theory of moral sentiments. So next time you see somebody wearing an Adam Smith necktie, you should go up to the person and say, I'm so pleased to see that you are in favor of progressive income taxes. I bet the person won't have any idea what you're talking about. Smith was in favor of luxury taxes. He thought people who rode around in expensive carriages should have to pay taxes on them, and the proceeds of the tax would go toward relief of poverty among the poor. So think of that as being in favor of people who drive BMWs and Mercedeses would have to pay a luxury tax to go for relief of low-income people. He was in favor of whiskey taxes and taxes on distilleries. That's pretty bold for somebody who lived in Scotland. He was in favor of much tighter regulation on banks than anything we know in the United States in our lifetime. So this was absolutely not a hothouse flower situation. Now, the question I pose in my book and seek to address is what enabled Smith, and to a limited extent others as well, to come to this insight? Well, some ideas, some causes are pretty obvious, I think. One is his training in Newtonian ideas of system and mechanism. I've already mentioned that. Smith was trained in and was very fond of Stoic philosophy. Stoic philosophy emphasizes the natural harmony of nature, and so in some ways it came naturally to Smith to think that by acting on your own self-interest, you'll make the world better off. Smith was a very observant man, and both in Edinburgh and in Glasgow, and for a few years in London, he lived in an increasingly commercial society He knew many of the merchants and he talked to them. And also Smith was a very insightful moral philosopher. And so introspection was clearly a part of the story. I think there's something else, however, and the additional element to which I would point is the religious thinking of the time, especially in the English-speaking Protestant world in which he lived. Now, what I have in mind in particular is the turn away from predestinarian Calvinism. In his famous book of 1904-1905, Max Weber pointed to belief in predestinarian Calvinism as the driver of people's behavior according to what he called the Protestant ethic. I'm looking at a later period, and therefore I think what drove the behavior of these thinkers who gave us modern economics, what formed part of their worldview was the movement away from predestinarian Calvinism. Some people have characterized my book as Weber upside down, and I think I'm in some ways comfortable with that. But let me be clear what I mean here. Calvin preached that all individuals are born with an utterly depraved character, unable to do any good, unable to tell good from evil. These are all quotations from Calvin. And by contrast, the post-Calvinists believe that all individuals are born with an inherent goodness. To use John Locke's famous metaphor, they have the candle of the Lord, namely reason, if they will only make use of it, and are completely able to tell good from bad, right from wrong. Second, in terms of human destiny, Calvin believed that the choice of whether any individual was to be saved in the afterlife or condemned to an eternity of punishment was a choice made not only before the person was born, but before the world was even created. And for this reason, there's nothing that a person could do in his or her lifetime would have any bearing on this decision. No choice a person could make, no action a person could take would make any difference for this. By contrast, the post-Calvinists believed that everybody was born able to be saved in the afterlife, and importantly, that people's choices and actions were efficacious for this purpose. To quote John Tillotson, the first Archbishop of Canterbury, appointed after the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688, people were able to cooperate with God in this choice. And then third, Calvin famously preached that the only reason we're all here to begin with is to glorify God, and the post-Calvinists believe that our being happy in our lives is not only a, but perhaps even the divinely intended purpose for us, and therefore it made sense that human institutions and the world in general would be structured, including markets, in such a way that this would be allowed to happen. Incidentally, all this is happening right at the same time as the creation of our republic, and therefore it's not surprising that instead of writing in our Declaration of Independence what everybody expected him to write, namely the Locke phrase of life, liberty, and the property, Jefferson wrote life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all part of the same process. Now, importantly, this debate was at its height right when Smith and Hume were coming into young adulthood and therefore forming their view of the world in an interesting way that I try to lay out in some detail. This movement away from predestinarian Calvinism was a rolling phenomenon. It was at its height in England in the latter half of the 17th century. It was at its height in Scotland in the first half and on into the middle decades of the 18th century, to repeat, when Smith and Hume were young adults and forming their worldview. And it was at its height in our country in the latter half of the 18th century and on into the 19th, the period when our republic was being formed. And importantly, these new religious ideas were hotly contended. We don't spend much time thinking about things that we all agree on. We focus on things that we disagree on. And because these ideas were fought over, that's what people like Smith and Hume would have paid attention to. Now, let's ask in some care, why would this religious debate have influenced their worldview, as Einstein called it, their vision, as Schumpeter had it? Well, first, they lived in a world in which religion was more central and more pervasive and multidimensional than anything we know in our society. All educational institutions were religious ones. Mine was as well in those days. Scotland had given up its status as an independent country in 1707, and so there was no government patronage to be had, but there was church patronage, and religion was an important part of the politics of the day. Second, intellectual life was integrated in those days in a way that it isn't then. Think of university faculties then. This is the complete faculty of Glasgow University when Smith was a professor there. Only 14 people had the word professor in their titles. Smith was the professor of moral philosophy, and right there on his faculty were a professor of divinity, what we would call theology, and a professor of church history. Well, my university today has theologians and church historians, but we segregate them off in something we call a divinity school, and we make them sit a half a mile away. Yale, for example, has a very distinguished divinity school, and it's more than a mile away. You have to really want to get there. It wasn't the same in those days. Scotland at this time of the Enlightenment was famous for its dining societies. The most distinguished intellectually was called the Select Society. Here's a listing of the professions of the 31 original members of the Select Society. Smith and Hume were absolutely part of the group, but 5 of the 31 were Church of Scotland ministers, including William Robertson, their close friend, who was the head of the church. And Robertson himself is an example of this integration. He was a very interesting figure. Robertson was simultaneously the head of the Church of Scotland and the principal, in our vocabulary, the president of the University of Edinburgh. It would be as if Larry Bacow were simultaneously the president of my university and the head of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Well, he isn't. Or as if our immediate past president, Drew Faust, had been president of Harvard and head of the Episcopal Church in the United States. Well, she wasn't, but Robertson was. And then the third reason is that the religious debate of that era was contentious in a way that's hard for us, at least in Western society, to understand. The 30 Years' War on the continent between the Catholics and the Protestants had been more deadly compared to the population of Europe than either World War I or World War II. The English Civil War, equally deadly, had been fought during the lifetime of Smith's and Hume's grandfathers. Even the Highland Rebellion. Here's a famous painting of the rebellion. Because of reading all these Sir Walter Scott novels, we think of the Highland Rebellion of 1745 in these romantic terms. Well, maybe it was, but it was mighty deadly. And part of it took place just right outside Edinburgh when Smith was 22 years old. He couldn't possibly have not paid attention. And importantly, there is a strong substantive coherence between this new economic thinking that Smith and Hume gave us and the new religious ideas of that time and place. In effect, what Smith and his contemporaries were doing was secularizing the dominant religious thinking of their time and place with its more benign view of the human character and their more expansive and more optimistic view of the opportunity, of the possibilities for human choice and human agency. And these religiously motivated ways of economic thinking have come right down to us. Today, economics is still all about human choice, human action, and the possibilities of it. The first fundamental welfare theorem is still the heart of our analytical apparatus. And if you scratch any economist, you'll still find this more optimistic view of human agency. Now, especially in the United States, more so, I think, than anywhere else, this religiously inspired influence has resonated right down through the 19th and the 20th centuries, through all of our debates over economics and the way in which the subject has changed as the economy has evolved, and the way in which the questions economists asked. And I think in the United States, we still have it today in the policy views, and especially the puzzling voting behavior of many ordinary Americans. And so let me finish with a few comments on that subject. A great puzzle that people have stewed about for some years now is why so many Americans vote against their own economic self-interest. The standard explanation that we have from our political science colleagues, popularized in a very good book that some people may have read by the journalist Thomas Frank called What's the Matter with Kansas? The standard explanation points to two features of our democracy in the United States. One is that we have a representative democracy, not a direct democracy. We don't vote for policies. We vote for candidates and for parties. And second, we have only two parties, and two is way too few to span the possible space of policy choices. And Frank illustrates that with just two dimensions. If we think about positions on economic issues and positions on social issues, think of people being able to have either liberal or conservative views on each of those sets of policies independently. Now, that would require 4 parties to give everybody a clean choice. People who are conservative on both policies find a natural home in the Republican Party. People who are liberal on both find a natural home in the Democratic Party. But what Frank focused on, and what many people have thought about, is what about these people? Think of states like Kentucky, like Mississippi, where people draw on programs like food stamps and supplemental income assistance and public housing to a far greater extent than in other states. So they would have an incentive to think in liberal terms for economic policy. But on social issues, they're very against abortion and very against same-sex marriage. So what do these people do? The argument that the political scientists make is that these people are drawn to vote Republican because they care more about the social issues than the economic issues. Now, this is a large part of the American electorate. This is the voting data from 2016. The red dots are votes for Trump. The blue dots are votes for Hillary Clinton. And you can see that this upper left, to go back, the people who would like to be liberal on the economics but conservative on the politics, this is about 30% of the electorate. We don't need to worry about the people in the lower right. That's only about 3%. So what about these? Well, I think that the political science explanation just doesn't make it, and here's a reason why. I think there's a strong correlation between this behavior and people's religious thinking. So here's an example. We don't, Frank and the political scientists are right, that we don't get to vote individually on policies, but we do have public opinion surveys in which people get to state their preferences. So here's the share of Americans overall that would prefer a smaller government providing fewer services rather than a larger government providing more. As you can see, Americans are pretty much divided. Mainline Protestants are a little more towards smaller government, but it gets much greater among the evangelicals and much, much greater among those evangelicals who'd identify their denomination as traditionalist. How about whether people agree with the proposition that government aid to the poor is helpful because people can't get out of poverty until their basic needs are met? On this one, Americans are exactly divided 50-50. Once again, mainline Protestants a little off, evangelical Protestants much further off, and by the time we get to traditionalist evangelicals, it's only about a third. Here's an extreme example, and I'll finish with this one. How about opposition to estate taxation? It comes as no surprise that people who have higher incomes tend to be more opposed to estate taxation. So in this chart, the blue bars normalized to 100 for the American population as a whole are the group's average income. And the red bars indicated on the right are the group's opposition to estate taxation. This is not about raising the minimum. This is about abolishing the estate tax altogether. Well, as you can see, in this poll from a few years ago, opposition to the estate tax was 44%. Today, it's 48%. Republicans, no surprise, higher than average incomes, higher than average opposition to estate taxation. Democrats, no surprise, lower than average incomes, lower than average opposition to estate taxation. Mainline Protestants, no surprise, higher than average incomes by a little, higher than average opposition to estate taxation by a little. What's interesting is the evangelicals. Lower than average incomes, even lower than the Democrats, and much higher than average opposition to estate taxation. The standard political science story cannot explain these patterns, and by contrast, the influence of religious thinking that I document going back to the 18th century can do so. So to conclude, economics was and is, of course, a product of the Enlightenment, but it's also a product of the religious thinking of that day. And I think this religious influence on economic ideas remains a very central feature of economics today, especially in the view of the American public. So Nan, let me finish there. Let me repeat, I'm honored to be with you, and I'm happy to take any questions. Sometimes people say, if you have a question, be sure it answers with a question mark. At Harvard, we don't believe in that nonsense. If somebody has an alternative point of view, I'm happy to hear it. So why don't I get rid of my screen, and the floor is back to you.
Great. Well, our first question, I'm glad to say, is from one of our award-winning teachers, Ted Opterbeck. So he asked, to what extent did the new religion-inspired humanist market-based economic way of thinking conflict with the economic systems in the earliest church and monastic communities, which seemed to encourage sharing of resources and communal living? And a follow-on, which is, were there any attempts to reconcile more modern thinking in the 18th, 19th century with that of the first few centuries in terms of economics and religious communities?
Well, to take the first one, the story that I've been relating is entirely about the English-speaking Protestant world. And your questioner correctly points out that thinking of the Roman Catholic scholastics, Aquinas and the like, was extremely different. There was very little value placed on markets, no notion of the value of competition. Instead of pointing about to prices as getting economic allocation steered to the right place, Aquinas was interested in what he called the just price. So it was completely different. Now, have there been attempts in more recent times to reconcile these? Yes, I think there have. There are Roman Catholic theologians. The one I know best is Dan Finn, who teaches at St. John's, St. Benedict's, but many others as well in the Roman Catholic community have attempted to build a form of economics that is more coherent with the scholastic thinking of the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th centuries. And also within the Protestant world, there have been lots of attempts to take thinking back to what's claimed to be the more communitarian principles of the early church. I would say the latter hasn't shown up so much in economic thinking as the Roman Catholic ideas.
So Ben, I remember one of the first times we talked was right after I heard you give a talk in New York City, and you were talking quite a bit about regulation. And I was curious as to what regulation was like when Adam Smith was talking about bank regulation in particular. I thought that kind of piqued my interest. And we also had a question about, today, it feels like there's a lot of legislation. Something happens on GameStop and there's a hearing immediately to say, should we regulate this? So I'm wondering what was the thinking in Adam Smith's time? I suspect the pendulum has swung back and forth, and of course, what your perspectives are.
Well, I'm happy to tell you what Smith thought. As I mentioned before, Smith was very willing to entertain the idea of regulations when they served an important purpose. In economics, we think of this as a story about externalities. Externality means, to take a classic example, pollution. What comes out of the tailpipe of my car, is bad for other people, and there's nothing in the price mechanism that makes me take advantage or take account of that, and therefore we don't leave it to me as an individual whether to spend more than an extra $1,000 to put a catalytic converter on my tailpipe. I'm required to do that. Now, Smith thought in exactly the same way. Smith didn't have the vocabulary, he didn't call it an externality, but he very much thought in those terms. You raised banking regulation, and I'll use that as an example. Smith's book came out in 1776. Only 4 years earlier, Scotland had undergone the worst banking crisis in 2 generations. Think of it as their equivalent of what we had 10, 12 years ago. And interestingly, during the height of the crisis, Hume wrote Smith a letter. And he said, I know you're working on a book. And he goes on and he describes all of the bankruptcies and people out of work and all that. And he says, do these events anywise affect your theory? Well, it turned out they did. And Smith's section on banking is a response to the banking crisis. You asked what were some of the regulations. He thought banks should be forbidden to charge more than 5% interest, because anybody who would be willing to pay more than 5% interest was clearly somebody who is doing something risky that shouldn't be funded. He thought banks should be severely restricted in the way in which they funded themselves. Think about all of these shadow bank liabilities. And then at the conclusion of the passage, Smith says that he favors these restrictions for the same reason that he favors the laws in Edinburgh that require firewalls between the row houses. It's a perfect example of an externality. So he absolutely had the concept of externality. He didn't call it that, but he had that, and he was willing to entertain all sorts of regulations if he thought they were necessary.
So, thank you. I'm still fascinated by regulation. So there are a couple of questions about why people are not aligning in the voting booth to their best economic interest. And somebody notes that there are a lot of big issues around that today. Things like health, there are things that are very emotional, healthcare, banking. Somebody asked specifically about why you think the working class evangelicals are more prone to vote against their economic self-interest. You know, can we segment this out? Is there something that's driving it in general, or is it very, you know, is it by segment? So I'm just wondering if you can say, I guess, a little bit more about the disparity between how people act and often not in their own self-interest.
Yes, in the book, I spend a lot of attention to this question of what is it that drives American evangelicals to have the economic views that they do. And there are several key elements of this. One is this strong tradition of voluntarism within American Protestantism, the idea that people who are happy to tithe their incomes and give to charity don't want to be forced to do that, because as soon as the government taxes them instead of their making a voluntary contribution, then it has a separate flavor. The most important one, I think, is some piece of the theology that isn't related to the Calvinism I talked about. It has to do with eschatology, has to do with people's view of the end times, whether people think the second coming is going to signal the end of the world as we know it, or whether that will herald a millennium of better life for individuals such as we know it. Now, talking about the second coming is not out of line in talking for purposes of beliefs of American evangelicals. More than half of them think that the second coming either probably or definitely will occur within the next 30 years. And this divide in American Protestantism between people who think that the second coming will herald the end of the world as we know it, so that individuals like us won't be here anymore, and those who think that it will usher in a better world, and even more so, people who think that having a better world in place will make the second coming happen faster. This is a very important view. Now, American evangelicals are almost entirely people who think that the world will end as we know it when the second coming arrived. The word for this is premillennialism, meaning that the second coming will happen before the millennium foretold in the Bible occurs. And historically, this has made premillennials very reluctant to entertain various kinds of reforms. The idea is you should spend your energy saving souls and preparing them for the second coming, not putting in place reforms that won't matter anyway once the world has come to an end. Now, it's important to be clear that this is much more complicated than that simple description implies, because there are a few reforms that premillennials have favored. In the 19th century, premillennials were very key players in the quest to abolish slavery, for example. Premillennials were very key players in the temperance movement against drunkenness. This was, after all, the crowd that gave us prohibition in the 1920s. So it isn't that they're opposed to every reform, but I think there's a very clear connection between what the theologians call premillennialism and the beliefs of American evangelical Protestantism and their willingness to oppose not only regulation, but taxes and government programs of all sorts. So I think it doesn't cling together cleanly, but it clings together unmistakably.
I have 3 questions here that are all great, and I'm going to try to weave them together a little bit because we're almost to the top of the hour. So the biggest broad question is, how are economists currently grappling with the ties and influences between economics and religion? And I would say that there are a number of people that have commented on the importance of having some important government programs to address things like wealth inequality, food insecurity, and, you know, there's a sort of other related question around, you know, are some of these influences currently in religion also affecting how we think about things? So I'd say in my synagogue, there's a big move around social justice issues, which people might not have talked about 10 years ago. And it's a liberal synagogue, but so there are all these themes of what's the balance, you know, and how are economists viewing what's happening today in the economy, what's happening in religion, and how are those playing off each other in the world we live in today, which is changing really fast.
Well, I'll try to be very brief, and I'll take on just 2 aspects of what you focused on. One, I don't think economists today are particularly influenced anymore by this kind of religious thinking. I draw in the book on the ideas of the historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, who paints a model of the evolution of intellectual disciplines in which at the beginning, in their early phases, intellectual disciplines are very subject in their fundamental thinking to influences from outside. And I think this was the case when Smith and Hume were writing, and then on to the 19th and even the early 20th century. But as Kuhn describes, and I think is right, as intellectual disciplines mature, that influence on fundamental thinking goes away. And I think it has. Economics is a mature discipline now. And so if you ask, where is this religious influence today? It's where we've just been talking about, namely the views of ordinary citizens thinking about economics. And of course, ordinary citizens don't give a hoot about economic theory. What they care about is the policy. So that's where you see it. Now, in terms of the influence of the ideas within the religious community on today's social justice and the surrounding issues, the parallel to which I would point people, and I have a chapter on it in the book, is the social gospel movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, and the division that it caused within the American Protestant community. The period then was very much like now. It was a period of very robust economic growth, but yet people became aware, and it surprised them when they became aware that this robust growth was happening and leaving all sorts of people behind. That was a new realization. And in response, the social gospel movement associated with people like Walter Rauschenbusch in New York, incidentally, Rauschenbusch's church is still there. I walk by it every once in a while when I'm staying at the Harvard Club. It's about 2 blocks away over on, I think, West 46th Street, not a church anymore. But people like Rauschenbusch, Washington Gladden, wanted the Protestant churches to take the lead in having a program of what they would, wasn't their word, social justice, it was your word, but they would have accepted that. They knew that the churches couldn't do this on their own. They knew it was a job for the government, and they looked to economists to design the programs, but they wanted the churches to provide the moral impetus and the political force behind it and to get this done. And by contrast, there was another line of thinking in New York, epitomized, for example, by Henry Ward Beecher. Beecher was famously the pastor at Plymouth Congregational over in Brooklyn, who thought, no, that just wasn't what the country should do and wasn't what the churches should do. So I think we're having a similar debate today, and if people want to get some historical insights, I would say look at the tussle between the social gospel and the so-called gospel of wealth in the decades between, say, from 1880 up to World War I think we're living through a similar period, and the forces at work in the American religious community, now of course not limited to Protestants, are very much the same.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom this evening. It's been great. And thanks to everybody who's joined us. I see that there were a few really fabulous questions that we just couldn't get to this evening. But I think I need to go back and tackle this book. It's sometimes helpful to have the overview. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Without you, we couldn't do the wonderful work that we do with people like Professor Friedman and some of the other people that I see that were joining us this evening to teach our nation's young people about economics and how it really relates to everything they see in the real world. So thanks very much for joining us, and thanks again to you, Ben, and thanks, Thomas, for helping us this evening.